This is our final day, and there are two things to be sad about. First, it's sad that it's our last day. I really hope you liked my class. I love teaching it, right? I hope it was just half as fun for you as it is for me. And of course, I'm sad as I am every day because we're not in a classroom. I can't see you. We're not interacting at all. All right, sorry. Now, sadness gone because I get to talk about Chomsky. You have seen in class how disgusting my love for Fromm is. My erotic love for Chomsky's intellect is on a par with Fromm's, and because Chomsky is still alive, right? He's getting old, but he's still alive. So this one is more of a threat to Chomsky's safety. I do not fangirl after him. I promise. I have never seen him speak in person. That would be just too weird, right? So, good. I do have an autographed picture of him, though. I really do. All right, so sorry. Briefly, let's talk about who this guy is. No, he is at near the end of his life. He is in semi-retirement, but in his heyday, for example, in the late 70s through the 80s through the 90s, when they would vote on, and they do this every year, big survey across the world, who is the most important intellectual on the planet? Chomsky won with a landslide victory for something like 8 or 9 straight years. I think it was longer than that. No one was even close. Now that he is in semi-retirement, now it's a competitive thing. Neil deGrasse Tyson's up there, Naomi Klein's up there, Peter Singer's up there, who you've read. Singer is really one of our most important intellectuals in the world, but for years it was Chomsky. Let's see. He first made his great fame by completely revolutionizing linguistics by saying there's an innate grammar. Blew everybody's mind. Let's talk about who he is more generally. Now, if he gives a talk in a foreign country, wherever it is, anywhere in the world, this is front page stuff on the newspaper. It is televised, standing room only, big deal. There is only one country where Chomsky is rarely on the television, and, well, maybe two, North Korea. The other one, obviously, where he doesn't get much press, plenty of people in this country don't know who he is. That is, of course, the United States, right? So weird. Now, when he gives talks, it's still standing room only, but the general public doesn't know much about him. The people who do know something about him fall into two distinct groups. You are either like me and love the guy. He blows you away with the things he brings to you, right? He brings up ideas that seem obvious when he says them, but they're brilliant. And he also brings information about politics to people like me that at first are just amazing, like that can't be true. And then you start looking into it and it's correct, and you are just grateful that this guy prevented you from being a dumb American. Anyway, on the other end, though, are people that read his works and can't get through that initial amazement. This can't be right, and so they hate the guy because he contradicts our basic assumptions and our basic beliefs about the world and especially our country. All right, so let's frame who he is in one more way. What people do in America is they commit the ad hominem fallacy. If you don't like what someone says, what do? You attack the person to make yourself feel better. Well, so what do we usually do when we don't like some intellectual and their ideas? We say, oh, he's an idiot. Okay, you're going to have to find a different criticism for Chomsky because he might be the smartest, if not in the top smartest people on the planet today. Let's talk briefly about his career. Briefly. Chomsky spent most of his career at MIT. Now, how good of a school is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology? Well, in linguistics, in mathematics, in engineering, right, throughout the whole gambit, probably psychology, we're up there pretty high in philosophy. Where does it rank in the world? The best school by far. It is better than Cambridge, better than Harvard, better than all these schools. Now, so Chomsky is a major professor at MIT. Well, let's talk about what position did he actually hold at MIT? He started out in linguistics and philosophy, but then he would get promotions because he was doing a lot of work in other fields, right? His last tenured position, which he held for years until he's semi-retired, was, right, let's guess, He was a professor of which department? Because he was no longer a professor of the linguistics and philosophy department. So what was he a professor in? He was what is called an institute professor at MIT. What did this mean? He was tenured to teach in every single department at the whole institute. He was the highest ranking professor, right, at the best school on the planet. So you can't call him dumb. You can still hate him for his ideas because they hurt your feelings, but he's brilliant and I love him. All right, let's start. Let's start on page 2 of the interviews reading. And let me first go over some basic truism, and then we'll let him speak. First, if you ever turn on political radio or go on political websites or listen to political YouTube videos, right, this is basically what you hear. You will basically hear someone giving their opinions, liberal or conservative, maybe libertarian. I doubt you're going to see any socialists or even social democrats. But here is the level of discourse. I hate those people, they're idiots. And how do people respond in comments or when they call in? How do people respond? Well, if they agree, they say, I agree with you, you're the best. If they disagree, they try to present their disagreement, and then the host shouts them down, you're an idiot, blah, 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 right? It's hideous. But, right, this doesn't make us lose hope about humanity. Because if you then, and here's what I used to do. I used to go out early in the morning every Saturday morning, and I would make sure that I was driving to go do things. I would turn on the Fantasy Freaks Fantasy Football radio program. I do not participate in fantasy football, but just listening to this show gave me hope for humanity. Let's describe how different this is from political talk radio. What's political talk radio? I agree with you, or you're stupid, and it's name calling. But sports, right? Try this. So the host would come on and they would say something like, and I don't know anything about this stuff, you should definitely start Julio Jones in your wide receiver slot because they're facing this defense. Julio Jones is recovering from his injury. Here are his stats, blah, blah, blah. Good? So some expert would say this. And then callers would call in and they would say, I disagree. I think Julio Jones is at best your 5th best choice of wide receiver this weekend. And then they would go off. Not in anger. No, it wouldn't be name calling at all. They would say crazy stuff like, no, I don't know. I don't think you're looking at how influential the high ankle sprain will be when there is 37% humidity predicted in the Atlanta area and the prevent defense they're playing is relying on, and they will go into numbers and stats and the assistant coach's divorce that he's going through. It's amazing. And it's brilliant analysis. Okay? So now, let's listen to what Chomsky's saying. Second line, page 2 of the interviews. Some years ago, for example, I did some work in mathematical linguistics and automata theory. That's robots and artificial intelligence. And occasionally gave invited lectures at mathematics or engineering colloquia. No one would have dreamed of challenging my credentials to speak on these topics, which were zero as everyone knew. That would have been laughable. The participants were concerned with what I had to say, not my right to say it. But when I speak, say, about international affairs, I'm constantly challenged to present the credentials that authorize me to enter this august arena. In the United States, at least, elsewhere not. A man at a public lecture. Chomsky, I'm wondering what specific qualifications you have to be able to speak all around the country about world affairs. You see it. Here's an audience member, doesn't like what he's saying. Here's Chomsky's response. What are my specifications, qualifications? None whatsoever. I mean, the qualifications that I have to speak on world affairs are exactly the same ones as Henry Kissinger. That's the Secretary of State at the time under Nixon. And that Walt Rostow has, right? That's who everybody quotes. It's a leading intellectual on foreign policy. Or anybody in the political science department, professional historians, none that you don't have. Got it? He is saying none of these people have the kind of qualifications you need, and neither does he. The only difference is I don't pretend to have qualifications, nor do I pretend that qualifications are needed. I mean, if someone were to ask me to give a talk on quantum physics, I'd refuse because I don't understand enough. But world affairs are trivial. There's nothing in the social sciences or history or whatever that is beyond the intellectual capacities of an ordinary 15-year-old. You have to do a little work, you have to do some reading, you have to be able to think, but there's nothing deep. In fact, I think the idea that you're supposed to have special qualifications to talk about world affairs is just another scam. It's kind of like Leninism, the position that socialist revolution should be led by a vanguard party. Sorry, I filled that in. It's just another technique for making the population feel that they don't know anything and they better just stay out of it and let us smart people run it. Now, I love this. This is one of the smartest people on the planet, and he keeps repeating this whenever he speaks. Nothing is that difficult, people. Study it for yourself. You will understand it, and you will challenge the status quo assumptions about things. Ah, brilliant. All right, next point. I asked you questions about how the U.S. spends money in its economy. What does it look like? And you also got to see the budget, so you got to see this. But let's ask a key question. Why do we spend so much money on the military? You've seen these documents now. Instead of spending money on public transportation or better roads or parks or, my favorite, hospitals. Why don't we have better health care? Look at what happens in the coronavirus. We don't have supplies. We don't have enough hospital beds. That's insane. Compare ours to, say, Singapore, Taiwan, right? They have a healthcare system because they spend money on it. Good? Anyway, let's try. Oh, now, actually, I should use a little tangent there, right? The United States healthcare system is the most expensive in the world by any way you measure it, whether total or per capita. We spend twice as much money as Taiwan spends, and their healthcare system is brilliant. It is so, so great. Anyway, sorry, that was a misnomer. It's how we spend our money, not just how much, but we spend more than anyone still. All right. So why do we buy bombs and not spend money on hospitals and healthcare? Just as an example, right? Let's let Chomsky talk, and then let's illustrate what he's saying. So I'll try not to interrupt him too much, but I can't stop myself. I get too excited. All right, so now we are on page 3, first indent on the page. If you take an economics course, they'll teach you correctly that if the government spends N amount of dollars to stimulate the economy, it doesn't really matter what it's spent on. They can build jet planes, they can bury it in the sand and get people to dig for it. They can build roads and houses, they can do all sorts of things in terms of stimulating the economy. The economic effects are not all that different. In fact, it's probably perfectly likely that military spending is actually a less efficient stimulus than social spending for all kinds of reasons. Okay, now, let's pause there and let's talk about what he just said. If you want to stimulate the economy, all you do is pour money into it. We saw this with the coronavirus. They realized that we've got to dump money in. They're sending money, hopefully this is going to arrive soon, to just everyone, to small businesses. Now, of course, they know how political campaigns work, so they're spending a lot of the money directly to corporations and rich people. Got it. You see, that's what they usually do. That was the Bush bailout as well. Let's get money into the economy by giving it to banks. Okay, whatever. Now, let's talk about these differences. Let's look at case A, where you spend money on bombs and jet planes. And case B, where you instead buy schools and hospitals. Okay? Here's the point. If you buy a bomb, how much does it stimulate the economy? Well, it stimulates the economy in the short term because you are spending money on materials, you are hiring people to build bombs, and then I guess you might blow up stuff with them, but that blowing up stuff with bombs doesn't really stimulate our economy that well. Then, what are you typically doing? Do we have way more bombs than we need? Of course. So I guess you're paying a couple people to guard them. Where are they buried? A lot of them are buried under our state soil. So I guess there's some jobs guarding the nuclear bombs under the grounds in New Mexico. Now, compare that to what happens if instead you spend money on bridges or schools or hospitals. What happens? Yes, you stimulate the economy in the short term, you spend money on resources, you hire people for jobs in building these things. But after they're built, what happens? Well, if you build a road, that increases commerce. People can get around quicker and it makes them more efficient in spending their money. If you buy schools and hospitals, what are you doing? You are not only hiring hundreds of people over the long term in those jobs, but you're also doing things that help the economy elsewhere. Education helps your workforce, gives you a more educated workforce. Hospitals keep your workforce healthy so they're more productive. Those things pay for themselves multiple times in the long term with future commerce. Now let's go back to Chomsky, right? So you see it. Spending money on bombs is the least efficient way to stimulate the economy. All right, here we go. But, Chomsky, the problem is spending for civilian purposes has negative side effects. He's being sarcastic, right? He's talking from the perspective of the government. For one thing, it interferes with managerial prerogatives. The money that's funneled through the Pentagon system is just a straight gift to the corporate manager. It's like saying, I'll buy anything you produce and I'll pay for the research and development, and if you can make any profit, fine. Okay. Notice what he's saying. If you give money directly to your buddies who make bombs, you can give money directly to your donors and control where the money is going. If I give money just in general, I don't know where they'll spend it. I don't even know if they're supporting me as their representative, as their president. They might not like me, and they might spend money in ways I don't approve. Damn. Keep going. The other point, which is probably even more serious from the perspective of private power, is that social spending increases the danger of democracy. It threatens to increase popular involvement in decision making. For example, if the government gets involved, say around here in building hospitals and schools and roads and things like that, people are going to get interested in it and they'll want to have a say in it because it affects them and it is related to their lives. On the other hand, if the government says we're going to build a stealth bomber, nobody has any opinions. Let's try that. When I first moved to Albuquerque, the big thing was whether to widen the bridge at Montano going over the Rio Grande River. Now, as I learned things about how hard it is traffic-wise to get across the river, I would have said, oh my gosh, we need a wider bridge. And so as soon as I looked into it, I was like, oh, that's great. That's good money being spent. It would stimulate commerce. That's great. But the whole society was in a huge uproar, like they are over our public transportation system downtown, right? What happened? They saw the price tag for widening the bridge, and people protested, how dare you spend that much money on this thing that would help people, right? They hated it. What did the money go toward instead? Military spending, a spaceport. Why? Because nobody cares about that stuff. Let's try an example. Please pause this video, right? And look up two things. Look up the F-35 fighter jet and look up what's called the Virginia-class nuclear submarine. Look them up and check their price tags. I hope you did that, right? If you did, what do you find? For example, the F-35. The F-35 cost approximately, they've gotten the price to go down because it was way overpriced. It used to be over $1 million each. Now I think they're $73 million each. Each F-35 jet is close to $100 million. And how many have we ordered? We have ordered 2,400 and something of them. That is insane. Do you realize how much money that is? If we just cut that contract in half, we could have preventive health care for everyone in this nation. What is fascinating about this? Now, are military things often very expensive? Yes. Is the F-35 pretty great? Yes, it's amazing. It's like a sci-fi movie. Why do I use the F-35 as an example? Because we don't need that many. Every branch of the military has said, that is enough, we don't need any more of these, and we keep building them. Why? For the very reasons Chomsky said. Because it's a donation to these companies like Lockheed Martin, General Electric, and we can just give these rich corporations money instead of giving it to hospitals and schools. Because what happens if you're going to build a hospital? Well, the people are going to get pissed like the Montano Bridge. They're going to say, why are you building a hospital there? We need one over here. And so what does the government do? Screw it. We'll just build another bomb. We'll just build another fighter jet and the people will stay out of it. Brilliant. What about the Virginia-class nuclear submarine? This one's amazing. If you looked up its price tag, these cost $2.8 billion each. Do you get what that is? That is, each one of them is healthcare for children in a whole state, right, like ours. That's insane. And last I heard, they were planning to have over 60 of these. Why is this fascinating? They don't need that much. That's insane. I'm pretty sure some of them are already being decommissioned because we already don't need the ones we have and we're building more. Now, here's where this story becomes even more fun. The Virginia-class nuclear submarine is a big giant submarine, nuclear powered, it's amazing. But this contract was started when they first planned to make these subs. It was started during the Cold War with Russia. Good? Now, oh, that's pretty fascinating. We're going to have a better sub than them, right? Here's the problem. The Cold War with Russia wasn't really a war. It was just another way to spend extra money. But pretty soon it ended. And we were in the midst of building these subs. So what did they do? They rewrote the contract so that it would now fit the war on terror. And of course, that started in Afghanistan and then moved to Iraq and now Syria. Now, how much naval warfare is there in the war on terror? Almost none. The only beachfront is in Iraq, and it's tiny. And by the way, you can get there, you can walk there from Kuwait, or take a rowboat, or take an ordinary boat. Here's what they did. I'm not joking. For an extra, what would you call this? An attachment? You could spend an extra, I think it was $150 million, and convert the torpedo tubes on the submarine to launch Navy SEALs onto the beach in Iraq. I am not joking. This was the way to convince people that it was still relevant to the war on terror. This is a $2.8 billion raft to get Navy SEALs onto the beach when they could already get there through Kuwait. All right, I can't stop myself from one more tangent, right? Now, please note that Chomsky is what would be called an anarcho-syndicalist. He is an anarchist, not as full to the left as a Kropotkin, but somewhere like I would hope could work out. In other words, he thinks workers should organize production. We don't need a centralized government. Anyway, when people hear this from him, they freak out, right? And so let me just jump in. You read this interview. It's really great talking about job satisfaction and why people work. But let me do this little quick tangent. This is page 3 near the bottom. A man in the audience says this. He gives the standard capitalist assumption about human nature. Here's what he says. But you could say that to truck and barter is human nature, that people are fundamentally materialist and will always want to accumulate more and more under any social structure. Truck and bartering just means you will always trade for profit, right? That is just the way humans work. Chomsky, notice the sarcasm. He is actually a nice guy, right? But he loves sarcasm. Here's what he says. You could say that, but there's no reason to believe it. Do you get what he just said? He just said, yes, I understand your point, but there's no reason to think it. That is a stupid idea. Then he goes on. You look at peasant societies. They go on for thousands of years without it. Do those people have a different human nature? Or just look inside a family. Do people truck and barter over how much you're going to eat for dinner? Well, certainly a family is a normal social structure, and you don't see people accumulating more and more for themselves regardless of the needs of the other people. Brilliant. All right. So let's go back to closer to the topics of the reading questions. Good? So let's now talk about foreign policy. Let's start with this topic, right? And he is a world leader on this topic, although in the United States, he pisses everyone off. Okay? Let's start at the very beginning, and please note that this is written in 1985, because this theory fits Afghanistan, Iraq perfectly. And so notice he even says as much about you could become a predictive prophet. Very beginning of the article. I'll start by talking about the geopolitical conception. And I'd like to stress that, in my opinion, if you don't understand this geopolitical conception, the chances that you'll understand what is happening in the world are relatively slight. Whereas if you do understand it, quite a lot of things fall into place and you could even get a reputation as a good prophet. That's exactly right. If you understand this stuff, when you read the news, it all starts to make sense. Let's go to the bottom of page 1 and follow on to page 2, and let's talk about the basic idea that he calls grand area planning. What is he saying, right? This has been our foreign policy basic project since World War II. Let's listen. Last 4 lines, page 1. Kennan was the head of the State Department policy planning staff in the late 1940s. In the following document, PPS 23, February 1948, he outlined the basic thinking. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction, being good people. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we are then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. Yeah, right? Now, continue, skip 2 paragraphs, middle of page 2. These particular comments refer to the Far East, but Kennan applies the same ideas to Latin America in a briefing for Latin American ambassadors, in which he explained that one of the main concerns of U.S. policy is the, quote, protection of our raw materials, end quote. Who must we protect our raw materials from? Well, primarily the domestic populations, the indigenous population, which may have ideas of their own about raising the living standards, democratization, and human rights. Let me explain basically how this works. Let me show you. The common thing we do is, if a country is becoming too democratic or too concerned for its people's own interests, if it is too what you could call nationalistic, meaning caring more about its citizens than the United States, what do? We threaten or overthrow that society. Let's do a brief tangent on how these plans work, right? Let me see if I can do this off the cuff. When a country is no longer catering to our interests, when they are deciding to use their resources for their own people, we get pissed off. Step 1, we do a show of force in the area. We tell them that we do not like what you're doing. We want you to give us easier, cheaper trade. We don't like what you're doing. Stop it. We do a show of force. What does that mean? We put a submarine off their coast. We bomb a nearby island, right? Now, if that doesn't work, we go to step 2. What is step 2? We try some clandestine way to overthrow the government. We usually succeed, right? We don't always, but we try to overthrow the government. Now, if we can't do it in a secretive way, say someone like Castro is saying, no, the people are trying to kill me and people find out about it, then we look bad. So what do we typically do, right, if this doesn't work, right? This is actually even more common. We hire a nearby thug. Chomsky calls them a rent-a-thug. We hire someone in a nearby country that is a terrible person and will overthrow that government for us, and we support them and plan it all the way through directly, and they do our bidding for us. Here's the problem with that. When that rent-a-thug overthrows the government, they quickly realize that, hey, we're in charge here and we're terrible people. That's why the U.S. hired us. And so they take over and run that government their way, again, not catering to our interests. And so what typically happens here, now we have to either hire another rent-a-thug to fight the one we hired, or if that doesn't work, we reach the final step. We have to declare war and send U.S. troops to overthrow that government once and for all. Amazing. Good? We will see that followed through. We will see that cycle of hiring a rent-a-thug and then having to overthrow the thug we hired. We'll see that happening when we get to what I'll call a game show coming up. Right? The last thing we'll do is have fun and do a game show. Go to page 4. Here's how it works. Second indent on page 4. Take human rights. Now, actually, that's an empirical question. You can study how American foreign policy is related to human rights, and it has been studied for Latin America and elsewhere. Skip 5 lines. So Herman does this study, and Herman finds that there is a relationship between human rights and American foreign policy. Namely, the more the human rights climate deteriorates, the more American aid increases. The correlation was strong. It does not result from a correlation between aid and need. Notice, you could say that, oh, well, when a country's doing bad, we're going to send aid to help them. No, just the opposite. We are sending aid to worsen their situation. This aid included military aid, and it went on right through the Carter administration. To use his words, quote, aid has tended to flow disproportionately to Latin American governments which torture their citizens, to the hemisphere's relatively egregious violators of fundamental human rights. This might suggest that Kennan understated the case. Human rights are not irrelevant, rather, we have a positive hatred of them. We send aid precisely to those governments which torture their citizens, and the more effectively they do so, the more we'll aid them. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. That former study was by Schultz. This next one is by Herman. Herman, second line of that next paragraph. Herman found the same correlation. The worse the human rights climate, the more American aid goes up. But he also carried out another study which gives you some insight into what's really happening. He compared American aid to changes in the investment climate. The climate for business operations as measured, for example, by whether foreign firms can repatriate. That means take their money from that country and bring it back to their company in the United States. And that sort of thing. It turned out there was a very close correlation. The better the climate for business operations, the more American aid, the more we support the foreign government. That gives you a plausible theory. U.S. foreign policy is in fact based on the principle that human rights are irrelevant, but that improving the climate for foreign business operations is highly relevant. In fact, that flows from the central geopolitical conception. Now, key point. Now, how do you improve the business climate in a third world country? Well, it's easy. You murder priests, you torture peasant organizers, you destroy popular organizations, you institute mass murder and repression to prevent any popular organization, and that improves the investment climate. Let me explain why briefly. Here's the idea. Some leader is creating a socialist government, a democratic government, even just a liberal or even democratic republic. And what does that mean? Well, if you have a democracy, people are going to want increases in healthcare, education, roads, plumbing. And so they're going to demand that you use their resources for the benefit of the public goods. Well, if you want to stay as a democratic leader, you are going to spend money in ways that benefit your people. You're going to stop selling all your oil to the United States at a cheap price. You're going to stop selling them your pineapples really cheap. You're going to want fair trade so that your people can have hospitals, roads, and healthcare. Well, the United States doesn't like that. So what do? Overthrow these democracies and these popular uprisings so we can put a dictator in power, because a dictator doesn't care about using resources for their people. They'll sell them directly to us, and they'll get sports cars, and their people will be screwed. Now you get how it works, right? Now let's look at the stats about how the United States is really unique in the world. When we compare the United States to countries that we should be comparing ourselves to, no, you don't compare the United States to Uganda and say, look how great it is. No, we have tons and tons of wealth and we have a democracy, so we should compare ourselves to developed countries. How do we do? Infant mortality rate, how do we do? The worst in the industrialized world. How do we do on life expectancy? The worst in the industrialized world. Obviously, the main factor is healthcare. But I want to read for you, right? This is a quote from the Congressional Budget Office of the United States. This is our own government talking about its own data. Good? So, I did not use data from people like me. I used our government's own quote. Here it is, bottom of the page, second line of the memo. A society's infant mortality rate is considered an important indicator of its health status because infant mortality is associated with socioeconomic status, access to health care, and the health status of women of childbearing age. So, for some of you who think infant mortality rate is a very weird little stat to look at, no. It is probably the best single stat for seeing how well a country is run, how well does it keep its infants alive. That's a basic indicator of how successful and efficient a society is. Now, how efficient is the United States at this? The worst of all rich countries. Keep going with the quote because it gets even more sad. Quote, variations in infant mortality rates among the states and between different racial and ethnic groups in this country are greater than the differences between the United States and many other countries, and then it says it's getting worse. So notice, it says the worst part of this. If you are rich, your infant mortality rate is great. If you are poor, it's on a level with the poorest countries in the world. So notice, if we looked at the infant mortality rate numbers and looked at them just for rich people, it would be up there with the other democracies in the world. What if we looked at only poor and working class people in the United States? It would be way off this chart, below all of them by a great margin. Now, if you're a racist or hate working class people or poor people, then congratulations, we have a great society. I'm sorry, that was too far. No, it wasn't. That was fair. Try the next part. So now let's look at the budget totals, right? So how do we spend our money? Now, of course, this is the discretionary budget. This is the budget that the president produces every year, right? This is the budget that changes year to year. There is also the total budget, right? So when you look at the footnotes about the war on terror, notice that is coming out of the total budget. It's not in the discretionary budget at all. The total budget includes huge expenses also like Medicare and Social Security, but who pays for those things? We do, right? That is not our general tax dollars going in. Those are special tax dollars, and we will collect those things when we're 65. So those shouldn't be compared to military spending. Does it benefit us? That's the question. I don't see it benefiting us at these numbers. All right. The key thing I just want to point out is the first footnote, right? Let's just talk about that briefly. What does it say? The next largest defense budget in the world is China's, which is roughly $114 billion. Notice, compare that just to our Virginia-class nuclear submarine or our F-3 fighter jet contract, and we're right there, just in those pieces of equipment. But anyway, in the last few years, the U.S. defense budget has surpassed the defense budgets of the rest of the world combined. Now, that number is always right on the border, but Trump has made it up past that margin again. We now spend more than the rest of the world combined. Do you get the idea, right? Who are we fighting against? Everybody at the same time? No, it's hideous. We do not need to be spending this much, especially with our tech being better than anyone's. It's ridiculous overspending. What should we do before you misunderstand me? Take a bunch of that money and send it directly to the troops. Send it directly to Veterans Affairs. Give it to healthcare for soldiers. Absolutely do that. I am not saying give this money to someone else. No, let's cut that money, give it away to the American public, especially to soldiers. Brilliant. Next, right? Let's look at some of the other stats, right? You can look at a bunch of these on your own. Let's see. Read what it says about the International Criminal Court System. That's fascinating. The only reason we don't participate. Now remember, we studied the Eichmann trial. The Eichmann trial had to take place in an International Criminal Court because otherwise it would have fallen under the laws of Germany, and Eichmann followed the laws. What does the United States think of the International Criminal Court System? We refuse to participate. Why? We know that our military would be involved and would be prosecuted for the things they do throughout the world. We'll talk about that during the game show. Then we can look at our United Nations voting record, right? This is pretty interesting. Let me just highlight a few of my favorites because they make sense of what will happen in our U.S. foreign policy examples, right? Here are my favorites, right? Let's just go for some Reagan ones, but again, these keep happening again and again. These are just the ones that paved the way when we really started to change these things. Now, to be clear, in the 60s and 70s, it was Russia that was stopping all of these things from happening. But when Reagan came, it became us that was stopping all of these things. That's why these votes are so interesting, but these same votes are continuing throughout the years, right? So don't worry with how old the dates are. Let's look at the second example on page 3, halfway down the page, right? What is this one? The establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. What does that mean? This would mean that no one in the Middle East could have nuclear weapons. Wouldn't that be great? You don't have to worry about Iran having nukes anymore. No one could have them. By the way, who voted for this? Iran, Iraq, all the countries in the Middle East voted yes. Who voted no? The United States and Israel, because Israel secretly has nuclear weapons that they got from us. We are the reason why we have to worry about nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Good? What's another good one? Number 131. The right of every state to choose its economic and social system. Do you get the idea? If you, now notice what we just said. We just talked about when the United States overthrows a government to replace its economy. Well, that vote makes sense now. We want to intervene in an economy and change its economy for ourselves. This vote would say that no, a country gets to run its own economy. That seems basic. The United States stops it with the only no vote. Now pause. How can the United States stop something when the vote is 131-1 against? It's because we have veto power, because we're a permanent member of the Security Council of the UN, so we can veto anything the rest of the world agrees to. Should we talk about others? Prohibition of nuclear weapons and making new nukes and making chemical and bacterial weapons. We vetoed those two. The rest of the world wanted to get rid of nukes, get rid of chemical weapons. We said no and stopped that from happening. We want to keep them because we want to be able to use them like we did in Iraq. Like we had Saddam Hussein use in Iraq for us. Oops, I'm giving away the game show. All right, now let's just have some fun, right? If we were in class, I would give out candy, but please play this game with me, right? I'll put the questions up on my little fake board over here, right? And so what we want to do is go through. We'll start the first 3 questions, just question and answer. Let's pretend this is like a pub quiz in England. I'm just asking questions, see if you can answer them. Now, of course, would I love it if you cheated and looked this stuff up? I would love it. It would mean that you finally deserve the internet. You are not looking up what Beyonce's shoes look like. You would be actually looking up things that would help you be a more informed citizen. All right, so please cheat all you want, right? Good. So first 3 questions are just straightforward, right? Here we go. First question, how many military bases do we have in other countries? Okay, so notice that question. How many U.S. military bases are there in other countries? Now, please notice, I use these first 3 questions as basic questions that people's intuition should understand what they mean. For instance, if I am talking to someone, then they will not deal with all of the details of foreign policy. They don't have time to look that up. I start with these kinds of 3 questions because these, anyone should be able to frame and understand them. And you could look them up really easily. You don't have to worry about what website it is. Although, in fact, almost any of these are probably on Wikipedia. All of this stuff is well known. It's just we're not very informed. But the first 3 should be common knowledge things that people, especially your older relatives, could really think through. So, how many military bases does the United States have in other people's countries? Now we can ask. Let's frame that question. Saudi Arabia and North Korea, they are pretty terrifying countries if you ask me. How many foreign military bases do they have? How many military bases does Saudi Arabia or North Korea have in other people's countries? None, right? That would be ridiculous. The other countries would freak out. Good? How many military bases outside of the United States does the United States have? Guess. No. The lowest number in any recent history, they are kind of opening and closing all the time, is over 700. Do you hear what that means? Over 700 U.S. military bases in other people's countries, and almost all of them hate their presence, right? That'll help you with a question coming up later, but most of them, the countries hate that they're there. We have a good relationship with some countries like Germany. They seem okay with it, but most of the other countries absolutely hate that we have a military base in their country. What does that say? Now, if you are in these other countries, how do you feel about that? Do you trust the United States to always do the right thing in your country? And in your bordering countries, you know more about this stuff than U.S. citizens if you're a foreigner. And so, no, right? Sometimes you would think, well, they're here to protect us. Then we'll see how that works. Question 2. Do the nations we intervene in develop? This is one that anyone with a kind of sense of the world should be pretty floored by. Because what you can do is look at different countries, and we can compare countries that are exactly the same in resources. You can take countries that are right next door to each other and just ask the question, did it develop, and was the United States in control of its development? So you can take countries that Japan was in control of. We can compare countries like Taiwan, right? We can compare countries, or go to a country like the Philippines or Vietnam or Cambodia. Look at Thailand, right? A country, again, using a Japanese development model versus the Philippines versus El Salvador, Nicaragua, all of the countries that the United States has control over its development. What do you see? What do you see? If it's a country that the United States did not control, it has developed. Many of these countries in Asia, for example, that Japan has oversought its development, are fully developed countries. They have developed into first world status. You could move to these countries tomorrow and be perfectly at home with how advanced their education and healthcare, right, all of their systems are. Compare that to the countries that we develop. What do you have? Latin America, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, right? What do these countries look like? Backwards, right? They are developing incredibly slowly in the world. General issue. Try the third question, right? This one's fun. Of the approximately 50 governments we have overthrown since 1945, in how many did we set up a more democratic government with improved human rights? Now notice that. As far as the American public is concerned, that's always the goal. When we intervene, it's for human rights and democracy because that's what the United States is like. I am so sorry. I wish this was true, but let's talk about our batting average. Now, let's pretend that you are in Major League Baseball and you've been at bat 50 times. And you've struck out 47.5 times out of 50. I guess half means you got hit by a pitch, so you didn't strike out. Good? What would that mean? Either you suck at baseball and should stop trying to be in baseball. Your batting average is the worst. Or it means you're not trying to get a base hit at all, right? It means that you're just standing up there and you have some other goal. I have no idea what it is. Maybe you're a pitcher and they put you out there, you're not expecting to get a hit. Well, that is the United States success rate if it is trying to promote human rights and democracy. What do we have? Let's see. Kosovo, South Korea, those are the two that we did improve democracy and human rights. What's the other one? The half would be the Dominican Republic. We weren't trying to promote democracy and human rights. It was just the best candidate we could find was into democracy and human rights. Not as much as the person we overthrew in the Dominican Republic, but still democratic and supporting human rights. So we get a half a point for that one. We diminished democracy and human rights, but it still ended up improving overall. Get it, right? Anybody should be able to look at those kind of numbers and say, wow, the United States either sucks at this, what they say they're trying to do, or that's not what they're trying to do at all. And if Chomsky's right, and he is, we are not trying to improve democracy and human rights most of the time. That is the opposite of our goal. Let's test it. So now, part 2 of this is I have written sentences out here, right? I have written sentences out, I will put them up, and you are simply going to tell me if they're correct or if they're wrong. If they're wrong, you are brilliant if you can pause the video and go look them up and correct them. Or if any of you know these facts, then I am just impressed by your level of informedness. But, so let's play this as a game. We will look at the basic claim, see if it's true or false. If it's false, we'll fix it. This is fun, right? I'm so sorry. But the fact that most people don't know this stuff makes this so exciting because I'm such a know-it-all. I love having information people don't know. All right. Question 4. The 3 reasons the 9/11 terrorists attacked us were freedom, freedom, and freedom. Sorry, that one's just funny. Because that's what we were told. They hate our freedom, that's why they attacked us. Good? Okay. Correct or correction? Correction. That is so wrong. Good? Let's explain. To explain why some terrible people do terrible things does not excuse their doing it, but it is good to find out why people do terrible things so you can prevent it. Well, why did they attack the United States on 9/11? What were the actual reasons they did this for? 3 of them, right? The major reason was one that we could preview from before. What is it? Military bases in the Middle East. We have military bases on the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. What does this mean? This is holy land in Islam, and we have a military base on holy land. This would be like most of you, let's say you're Catholic. How would you feel if there was a Saudi Arabian Muslim military base inside the Vatican? That's what this is like. They hate our military base's presence. Second reason for the 9/11 attacks, right? Our support against Palestine and for Israel in Israel. Now, is Palestine great people? No, they do terrible things. Israel does terrible things too. To pick a side is hideous. In fact, if you're picking a side just by the numbers, Israel kills more children and civilians than Palestine does. But again, this is just picking between someone who rapes more people, someone who rapes less people. But still, you do not pick a side in that debate, especially the side that is slightly worse. Anyway, third reason will become obvious as we look at more and more of these things. We constantly overthrow their governments. We do not let the governments in the Middle East have sovereignty over their own countries. How would you feel if another country overthrew the US government? You would be pissed too. 3 reasons, fix those. It's not freedom. Question 5, related question. The 9/11 terrorists were from thug groups we attacked: Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Syria. Those are the countries we're currently killing people in. That's where we're sending American troops, and it must be for a good reason because they attacked us on 9/11. Correct or correction? Correction. That's absolutely false. None of those countries had anything to do. Now, I guess Al-Qaeda could have done some training in Afghanistan, but that had nothing to do with the actual majority government in Afghanistan. Good? So correct this. Where were the 9/11 terrorists from? Key question. Were they from countries that are our enemies or countries that were and are our allies and that we send aid to? All our allies. Where were they from? Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, and Egypt. All allies that are direct supports for Al-Qaeda and against us in the war on terror, and we send them military aid all the time. Damn. 6. Let's see if you're getting the hang of this, right? Number 6. Is this true or false? We overthrew the democratic Mossadegh over oil and set up a Muslim monarchy instead. That one's correct. Yes. Mossadegh was making the society more democratic, right? He was improving equal rights between men and women, and he was using the gas resources to increase spending in healthcare and education in Iran. The Iranian people loved him. I have a friend, a very old woman now, who got her PhD at this time when Mossadegh was president, right? Great leader. What did we do? Put a religious monarchy in power instead, the exact kind of government that we now hate Iran for having. We replaced the government that was more democratic with the Muslim monarchy that it has to this day, and we'll see the results of that. Damn. Question 7. Look at Iraq. We hired Saddam Hussein to attack Iran for us when Iran revolted against our Shah. Correct. Yes. We hired Saddam, remember, as a rent-a-thug. We hired him and supported him in Iraq as long as he would bomb Iran and gas the Kurds in the north. The very thing we accused him of doing is something we planned to prevent the power of the Kurds and the Shah in Iran. Again, the very Shah that we hired then decided to run Iran in his own way, and so we hired Saddam to attack him for us, the very person we hired. Now, you should be able to follow this, right? Now, of course, what happens in Iraq after that? We have to attack Saddam Hussein. We actually execute him. That's the very guy that we hired to do our bidding before. He got his own ideas about how to run Iraq. He wasn't following our directions anymore. We were paying and supporting him. He didn't do what we wanted, so we had to attack the person we hired. Are you getting the theme? Number 8, Afghanistan. Look, you're getting a current events update, the history of these countries that we're involved in right now. Afghanistan. Russia took over and hired the Taliban and terrorists to keep us out. Is that true? Is that how it worked? Did Russia hire a bunch of terrorists to prevent us from helping Afghanistan? No, that's incorrect. That's false. What's the actual story? Well, the beginning is somewhat true. Russia overthrew the government of Afghanistan and took it over. What did we do? We hired the local rent-a-thugs to fight Russia for us. Who were the rent-a-thugs we hired? The Taliban and the Mujahideen, the very people that were part of Al-Qaeda. We hired a bunch of terrorists and the Taliban to overthrow Russia and control Afghanistan on our behalf. What happened next? Of course, you know how the cycle works. We then have to go to war in Afghanistan to fight against the very people that we hired and supported. Are you getting the theme? Question 9. Let's talk about Vietnam. Let's see if this is correct about it. The communist Ho Chi Minh stops the elections in the South, and we support the Democratic Diem. Is that how it worked? No, correction. What happens? Ho Chi Minh wins a landslide election of democracy in the North, and we stop the elections in the South because Ho Chi Minh is going to win, and he's a communist. Why? Because communism is popular in Vietnam. What do? We stop the elections. Now notice that. We're supposed to be supporting democracy, but we stop the elections from happening so that we can have a couple years to win the hearts and minds of the people to vote for our guy, a guy named Diem. Now, let's talk. Who did we put up that we wanted the Vietnamese to elect in the South? The Vietnamese are socialistic, communistic Buddhists. What is Diem? A Catholic capitalist, right, that we thought they would like. They hated him. He was so corrupt that we supported his assassination pretty quickly after that, right? That was our guy. No chance of winning. Well, how did we think we were going to get him to win? By bombing the hell out of the South and putting people in concentration camps, right? Now, wait. Right there, if you know Vietnam, you would think that, wait, no, our enemy was in the North because those were the communists. We were helping the South. No, we were bombing the South to get them to be so terrified that they would vote for our guy. Look it up. Question 10, Panama. Noriega was trained and paid by us to be our thug. We had to attack the thug we hired. Yes, that one's correct, right? We were paying Noriega through the CIA, trained him, and then he got his own ideas when we put him in power in Panama, so we had to overthrow our own guy. That's the normal story. Go to Haiti. Now, some of you saw footage of Haiti when there was that big earthquake and the country was devastated. Now, to be clear, a lot of that terrible footage was not that different from what Haiti is like already, right? A lot of the camera footage you saw was barely damaged by the earthquake at all. That place is poor and miserable. Why? Because of us. Oh, sorry, I'm giving away too much. In Haiti, we opposed the genocides of the Duvaliers, this is Baby Doc and Papa Doc Duvalier, and kidnapped the leader to allow elections so we could support the elected Aristide. Of course, that's wrong. When the genocides of the Duvaliers are happening right in our backyard in Haiti, we do nothing to stop them. In fact, we send aid, right? So weird. Then what happens, right? Aristide, I think he's a Catholic bishop. I can't remember. He's high-ranking in the Catholic Church. He helps stop the genocide and runs for election in Haiti and is elected, right? And they're going to start a new government without the kind of oppression over the Duvaliers. Well, the Americans do not like this. They like having more direct control over Haitian resources. So when he runs for re-election, we kidnap him so he can't run in his own election. Damn. Grenada. Pause the video and look up Grenada. Look it up on a map and see where it is and how big it is. Now, your question. We convince the American public that the tiny island is a huge threat, so we overthrow the democratic government of Bishop. Correct. That's what we do, right? He was starting to trade with socialist countries, and he was building an airport, and so this was our excuse. Now, what was the society like? They produced what? Nutmeg, I think, was their major export, but this was a threat to our ideas. It was a threat to, you can't be socialist and democratic on your own. You have to cater to our interests. So we overthrew this tiny country, right? And it was hilarious. It was, I think there was one friendly fire death and a sprained ankle. We overthrew the whole island government very quickly. Like the Panama invasion, we overthrew that whole place in days, right? These are way overmatched people that we convince the American public are a threat to us. Right? It's crazy. 13, El Salvador. Try this one. This one's fun. The CIA secretly sells guns to Iran and drugs to Los Angeles to fund terrorists killing peasants and nuns. Could that be true? Come on, Jeff, you're getting it. That's actually true. That one is actually true. We were supporting the wrong people. Well, sorry. We were supporting the dictators and terrible human rights abusers in El Salvador. But this case is fascinating because this is happening after Vietnam, and the United States public no longer trusts the governments in their foreign policy. And so the American public finds out about what we're doing in El Salvador. We're killing nuns who are protesting our support for the guerrillas overthrowing the democracy. What do we do, right? The American public says, we will not fund this anymore. Stop funding the guerrillas in El Salvador. They're killing everyday citizens. So we had to find special ways to fund this war, getting around the Congress. So what did we do? We had Israel, a sworn enemy of Iran, sell guns to Iran and send the money to El Salvador for our guerrillas. We also, right, channeled cocaine. This is what became part of the crack epidemic in Los Angeles. We smuggled cocaine out and sold it in the United States to fund the guerrillas in El Salvador. Look it up. It's incredibly hard to believe, but it's true. Let's look at number 14, Rwanda. Some of you remember Rwanda. This is one of the most brutal genocides in history in its severity. People are being killed like 100,000 people a day. Of course, Nazi Germany wins if you're an evil, terrible person, but Rwanda is amazing in its psychology. Let's see. Now, as far as we know, right, that we had nothing to do with it. We did after. Listen. We not only did not get involved in the genocide, but convinced the UN to not intervene either. Correct. Right? We didn't want to look bad for pulling out our support for the people that were going to stop the genocide, so we convinced everyone to pull out from the country so the U.S. wouldn't look bad for pulling out. And so the genocide continued when it was actually could have been very easy to stop. Indonesia, number 15. Come on, easy one. We overthrow the dictator Sukarno and allow the election of the democratic Suharto. No, of course, that one's false. You can reverse it. We overthrow Sukarno, who's democratically elected, put Suharto in power, and we'll see in a second what he does. By the way, this one's actually especially interesting because Obama, our former president, lived there at the time as a little kid. He was born in Hawaii and then moved to Indonesia, and he even mentions this in his autobiography. I forgot what it's called. Let me look for it on my bookshelf. I think it's called The Audacity of Hope or something like that. He even talks about it in there. He even says, Unfortunately, the U.S. did a terrible thing in Indonesia. Sukarno was a good leader improving our country, and the U.S. overthrew him and put a terrible person, Suharto, in power. Interesting. The president often admits this stuff. 16. East Timor. Suharto, yes, the guy that we just put in power in Indonesia, kills 1/3 of the population of East Timor with our support. Yes, that's true. Got it? Cambodia. Try that, right? This is fairly famous with your parents or probably your grandparents' generation, right? Cambodian boat people fleeing the harshness of Pol Pot, trying to find freedom in this country. Let's talk about what happened. Cambodia. The Vietnam communists support Pol Pot's genocide. The U.S. intervenes to stop the genocide. Is that what happened? No, obviously you know how this works now. The U.S. did nothing to stop Pol Pot. In fact, for many years, both before and after the genocide, right, and in the beginning of it, we are supporting Pol Pot, right? We are applauding what he's doing. Nobody is knowing the genocide is happening, but we are in support of his government. It is the communists in Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh that stopped the genocide, right? Everybody knows Pol Pot was a terrible genocidal freak. It was the communists in Vietnam that we opposed earlier that stopped the genocide. We didn't. Chile. We overthrow the democratic Allende and put the dictator Pinochet in power, and he tortures 40,000 of his citizens. That's absolutely correct. That's true. South Africa. We are allies with Mandela and declare the apartheid government as terrorists. Is that true? No, it's the opposite. We are allies with the apartheid government and we declare Mandela a terrorist. We actually just remembered to take him off our terrorist list right when he was released from prison, I think it was. Right? So even when everybody knew Mandela was a great guy, he was still on our terrorist list because apartheid were our friends. Damn. Lastly, try this one. Guatemala. To help United Fruit, we overthrow Arbenza's democracy and install the dictator Armas. That one's true. Notice, we are overthrowing a government there because we don't like the prices being charged for pineapples and bananas. We do this on behalf of what is the United Fruit Company. That's the kind of stuff we do because that's to help a corporation. Does that help the American people? No. Right? All right. Thank you so much for taking this class. I am so sorry we had to go down to videos, right? I hope they were not terrible. Thank you so much for taking my class. I miss you. Bye.